my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am stealing a video idea with permission from Angela over at Literature Science Alliance. She recently posted a video going through the 20 books on her Goodreads that she has read that have the lowest average Goodreads rating and discussing whether or not she thinks that's fair. I took a look at what my bottom 20 were and I thought, oh, this will be wildly entertaining. I must make this video myself. Let me tell you a little story here. Paint a picture, set the stage. Once upon a time, in an ancient year that was called 2015, a young college graduate named Kelsey, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and free for the first time in years to read books that had not been assigned to her by teachers, signed up for a Goodreads account and started publicly chronicling her reading on the internet for all posterity. Now, the reason young Kelsey signed up for a Goodreads account was because she had no good sources of book recommendations. She had no idea what she was supposed to be reading as a newly minted adult with some free time. And some of her early choices on what to read and whose recommendations to follow were questionable. Around this same time, young Kelsey also discovered BookTube, but the content creators she was following were not yet the group of people who would start to later give her recommendations better tailored to her tastes. It wasn't until the next year, 2016, that I started my own BookTube channel. That is the point from which all of my opinions on the books are chronicled on the YouTube. But it wasn't until I started putting my own BookTube content out there that I started to actually form connections and friendships with other content creators whose tastes were more aligned with mine, and that was when I started getting the good book recommendations. So while there are absolutely books on this list that I will vociferously defend, I will be so mad that they are on here, there are also a number of things here that I read back in the 2010s that, I don't know why I bothered with those books in the first place. So starting at number 20, I am going up the list from 20th worst average Goodreads rating all the way up to the final book, which will be the book I've read with the worst average Goodreads rating. Starting at the bottom with a 3.49 ranking is Starlings by Jo Walton. This is a story collection that has some gems in it, but is just not well put together as a whole. I am a huge fan of a really well-curated story collection where you can see that there's a reason that each of these stories was included. There are reasons that the order of the stories is the order that it was. It creates a reading experience from beginning to end, and this is not that. This is just a compilation of everything Jo Walton has written that could be considered short fiction. Whether or not it's any good, whether or not it thematically belongs in a book with all the other things. I read and reviewed a NetGalley arc of this in 2018 when it was published. That's on the internet, you can find it. I will say by far to me the standout from this story collection, the only story in this that I still think about at all today is a story called Turnover. This was published in Lightspeed, so you can read it online. It is a story about a generation ship and about a character on this generation ship who is a dancer in a form of ballet that is adapted to low gravity, and it's a contemplative exploration of the idea that this art form might not last once the ship eventually gets to its destination. So if you want to read my standout story from this collection, you can do that online for free. Next, at number 19, is a much more recent book that I wouldn't have expected to see on this list. It's Tread of Angels by Rebecca Roanhorse. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with this. I wasn't a huge fan of this novella. I gave it 3 stars. What has me scratching my head, though, is that the reasons I didn't get along with this book were the exact same reasons that I haven't gotten along with Rebecca Roanhorse's other books, and people love her other books. So what happened here? The only thing I can come up with is that maybe people are touchy when the mythology that you're messing with in a fantasy context is Christian mythology as opposed to someone else's mythology that you don't think of as religion because it's not yours. It's also possible that the ending of this was too much of a downer for the type of readership that's a huge fan of some of her other books. That also could be it. That's got a 3.48 rating. Next, with a 3.47 rating, is one of those books that I warned you about that will just make you wonder, why did Kelsey even read that? And that is Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler. I read this in 2016 when I was still watching booktubers who read a lot of young adult contemporary. I was young enough to remember being a teenager who read a lot of young adult contemporary. In retrospect, I didn't like any of the young adult contemporary I was reading as a teenager. I just wasn't picky and was reading anything that was on the shelves at my high school library, which, surprise, had a lot of young adult contemporary books in it. So it should not have shocked me that as an adult I liked young adult contemporary even less. I also don't think this is a good book. I gave it 2 stars. I remember a feeling of viscerally disliking it, although I remember absolutely 0 details about the book itself. And then several years later, some unsavory allegations came out online about Daniel Handler, and I was even more embarrassed to have even bothered reading this. Okay, next is the first book that I am actually going to disagree with tepidly. Space Opera by Catherynne M. Valente comes in at a 3.46 average rating. Now, I'm going to disagree with this, however, I think I know why this happened. Catherynne M. Valente is one of those authors with a very distinctive, kind of Marmite writing style. You're either gonna love it or you're gonna hate it. I've read a lot of books of hers, and this is the only one that is cracking the bottom 20 of my average Goodreads ratings here, and I think I know why this is the one that does it. This book was published in 2018, and it got nominated for awards the following year. And when a book gets nominated for awards, it gets read by a wider pool of people than are that author's normal readership. And when that's a love it or hate it type of book, it's gonna end up being read by a lot of people who aren't going to like it, who wouldn't have read it otherwise. This isn't one of my favorite Catherynne M. Valente books. I've given a lot of her books 5 stars. This was 4 for me. I gave all of the Fairyland books 5 stars. I gave both In the Night Garden and In the Cities of Coin and Spice 5 stars. Those were 2 books I read early on in my internet adult fantasy reading journey that were extremely formative for me. And I also gave 5 stars to Radiance, which was and still is one of the weirdest books I have ever read. This didn't leave nearly the impression on me of any of those books. Something that I can also say about this is I think this is a book that was very heavily influenced by the moment in which it was written. There were big feelings going on about the 2016 election and the following years of politics. And I remember feeling that that moment was reflected pretty strongly in this book and in like the nature of its optimism and hopefulness. But I don't know if that has held up as well in the years past. Like, I don't know if someone reading this now will make those same connections. Okay, we've got another one I'm gonna disagree with here. Also at 3.46, so this is a tie with Space Opera, is Uncommon Charm by Emily Bergslien and Kat Weaver. This is one of the Neon Hemlock novellas. It's a 1920s historical fantasy about a teenage socialite and a young man from a much less privileged background who comes to study with her mother, who is a magician. This is about family secrets and ghosts and the mysteries of magic. It is gothic, it is vibesy, it is also like witty and charming. I have no theories about what this book is doing on this list. None. Like, I don't think anyone's reading Neon Hemlock novellas who isn't looking for speculative fiction off the beaten path. Like, I don't know what you wanted this to be that it wasn't if you went out of your way to get your hands on this and read it. Next on this list at 3.45 is Moonshine by Jasmine Gower. Maybe fantasy readers just hate the 1920s? It's a working theory. This is a 1920s inspired secondary world fantasy that I gave 3 stars. It was fine. I'd have considered reading more in this world from this author, but I don't think we ever got anything more in this world from this author. The 14th worst rated book on Goodreads that I have read is the one that is flabbergasting to me, that I am borderline angry about. I don't think I'm going to get this angry about anything else on this list, and that is Under the Pendulum Sun by Jeannette. And yes, if you're thinking this cover looks similar to Moonshine, that's because it's the same cover artist and the same publisher. It's gorgeous, look at it. This book is like weird and dense, and I enjoyed it so much. It is this like deeply theological gothic 19th century fae fantasy. The fae world in this is so exquisitely weird. It was one of those books that I got to the end and thought this was a 4-star read, but on a reread this might be 5 stars. I really should reread this book because I did think that if I read it again knowing where it was going, I might get even more out of it. Holy moly, I was not expecting to see this book on my list of like lowest average Goodreads ratings. There is, I will say, something in this book that I do believe is a major spoiler, but is a content warning that some people might want to know. If you're really worried about that, it is hidden under a spoiler tag in my Goodreads review. Next at 3.43 is one of my most recent books on this list. This is Mortal Follies by Alexis Hall. This was a 2023 release. It was something that I pre-ordered and was kind of disappointed in despite really loving some aspects of it. I gave this a 3-star rating. It is a Sapphic Regency fantasy romance. So this is a romance novel, but the thing I loved most about it is this narrative framing device for the book that I absolutely adored, but I felt very strongly that it undermined the book's ability to function in a satisfactory way as a romance novel. This was extremely frustrating for me, and yet I still might end up reading the second book in this series. Ooh, next is a book that has a soft spot in my heart because it is by a nostalgic favorite author, Robin McKinley. This is like her least loved novel. In fact, I know it's her least loved novel because it's the only one of hers that shows up on this list, and I've read all her novels. I've only read it once. I read it in 2015. I would have acknowledged at the time that it was a flawed book, but I still loved it and gave it 4 stars, and that is Dragonhaven. The thing you need to know about this book is that it is a deconstruction of the teenager raising a dragon trope, in which raising a dragon is messy and unfun. The obvious flaw of this book is that it has an epilogue that's just way too long. I don't know who let her keep all of that. It needed to be cut, like in half at least. But up until that point, I really loved this in 2015. I enjoyed what it was doing. Will it hold up if I read it again? I don't know. The next book on this list is part of the only series that has multiple entries in this bottom 20. This is the second book in a duology. The first book is gonna be later on this list. This is The Sisters of the Crescent Empress by Leena Likitalo. The first book is The 5 Daughters of the Moon. I read both of these in 2017, which was the year in which they were both published, and this has a 3.40 rating on Goodreads. Now, I think I know why the first book is on this list. It is a, structurally messy start to this duology. But if you read the first book and liked it enough to pick up the second one, which is so much better, I don't know why you wouldn't rate this highly. Book 1 was 3 stars for me, book 2 is 4 stars. This is a fantasy situation that is inspired by Russian history and the fall of the Romanovs. This second book is sad and haunted and beautiful. Did people want a happy ending? Do they know what this is based on? I liked this book. For the record, it's like a novel-length sequel to a book that was a novella. I liked this one. I'm genuinely surprised it doesn't have a much higher rating than the first book in the series. Next, also with a rating of 3.40, so this is a tie with The Sisters of the Crescent Empress, is Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard. This one, I am not surprised. Disappointed, but not surprised. This is a standalone fantasy novella. It was released in 2021. I read it in, I think, early 2022, before most of my online acquaintances read it. I liked it, and then I was surprised and dismayed a bit that subsequently friend after friend online was saying that they didn't. It made me question my judgment. Did I fall prey to hype and give this book a higher rating than it deserves, than I would have given it if I had seen the less positive reviews first? I don't know. I think back on this book fondly when I think of it, which is admittedly not very often. If I were recommending a place to start with Aliette de Bodard's work, I would recommend one of the Julia novellas, probably Tea Master and the Detective or Seven of Infinities. This, though, is about the aftermath of a toxic romantic relationship when this person shows up in our protagonist's life again. I thought it was pretty well done. Okay, next book on this list is a real obscure deep cut. Sorry, this is The Stone Fae by Robin McKinley, which is an extremely out-of-print, illustrated edition of a short story of hers. This is set in Damar, which is the same kingdom as The Hero and the Crown and the Blue Sword. The illustrations are by John Clapp. It was published in 1998. Was it worth the 4 stars that I gave it when I went out of my way to get my hands on this through interlibrary loan at the height of my Robin McKinley fandom in Check's Notes 2016? Probably not. Moving on. The White Road of the Moon by Rachel Neumeier. This has a 3.37 rating. This is one of 2 books of hers I've read. That other one was adult. This one is YA. There are definitely other books of hers I would like to read that I think I might like. This one was just okay. I read it in 2019. It was published in 2017. It read to me like a YA book of maybe like a decade prior. It's a fantasy novel about a girl in a fantasy kingdom who can see ghosts and how she goes on an adventure and gets tied up in magical events. It just wasn't a standout for me, aside from the fact that it had some like kind of nostalgic old school YA fantasy vibes. Okay, I told you this was coming earlier. We've gotten to The 5 Daughters of the Moon by Leena Likitalo, the first book in the Waning Moon duology. This is 3.33 average rating. I think we already kind of discussed this. I'm just gonna move on. Here's a book I barely remember. Mirror the Mountain. This is a graphic novel by Emma Ríos, illustrated by Hwei Lim. I remember thinking this was confusing, even though the art was really pretty. It's kind of science fantasy, and they're just, I don't remember much about it. I clearly didn't get much out of it. Here we're moving into the top 5, or rather the bottom 5. Coming in with a 3.30 average rating is The Oddling Prince by Nancy Springer, which was published in 2018. I read and reviewed a NetGalley arc, and this is another one where it felt a little bit like a book of the wrong decade. Like, I really enjoyed the old school fantasy vibes, but it didn't feel like it was bringing anything new with those vibes, you know? I gave it 3 stars. At the time I was interested in reading more by Nancy Springer. I haven't followed up on that yet though. Next, in 4th place with an average rating of 3.27 is Bright Smoke, Cold Fire by Rosamund Hodge. This one is an oof. Like, a slightly embarrassed that I even read it oof. I read this when it was released in 2016 because I had really enjoyed a couple of this author's prior fairy tale and mythology inspired YA fantasy novels, and this one was supposed to be Shakespeare inspired. This is a very weird fantasy spin on Romeo and Juliet. This was, in my defense, before I was aware of this author's anti-abortion views, which are the real reason I will never read any of her books again. But also, it was not good. It just wasn't. I gave it 2 stars. Tying Bright Smoke, Cold Fire for 3rd place at 3.27 is Her Fearful Symmetry by Audrey Niffenegger, another thing that I read in 2016 for reasons that made sense at the time. I gave this 3 stars, which in retrospect was probably generous. Here's the kicker with this one. I was at this point online enough to know that this book was generally disliked, and yet somehow I thought I would be different. I would be the cool kid going against the grain who liked the book and like understood the book that everyone else thought wasn't as good as The Time Traveler's Wife. I don't know. 2nd place. We are here. At either 2nd place or 2nd to last place, depending on how you're counting. This is another one where I am upset, but I'm not surprised because I think I figured out what happened here. This is The Red Scholar's Wake by Aliette de Bodard, 2nd book of hers on this list, with a 3.22 average rating. I liked this book a lot. I gave it 4 stars. It is a sapphic romance novel set in her sci-fi Shuya universe with space pirates. One of the main characters is like a sentient spaceship who is also a pirate captain. I know exactly what happened here. I liked this book. I recommend this book. I do not recommend starting here with the Shuya universe. This book does not take time to like explain any of its world building. If you want to start with the Shuya universe, read Tea Master and the Detective. I think I said that earlier in the video. Tea Master and the Detective, or Seven of Infinities, or if you want something more melancholy, read On a Red Station Drifting. You're gonna like this better if you already know how the mind ships work. And yet, this was in an Illumicrate box. So this is like what I was describing earlier with what I think happened with Space Opera, getting all those award nominations, and being on award shortlists that people were reading, where Aliette de Bodard, less so than Catherynne Valente, but a little bit, is an author whose writing is not going to be for everyone, whose work was sort of indiscriminately put in the hands of a large number of people who weren't explicitly seeking it out. And also, this probably isn't the greatest entry point into her work. So, like, do I disagree with this low rating? Yes. Do I understand why it happened? Also, yes. And here we are at the last book on this list. We have made it to the very bottom of the barrel, and I'm going to ask you, as I did at the beginning, to imagine young Kelsey. Except instead of imagining young Kelsey in 2015 signing up for a Goodreads account, I want you to go back a bit further, like the summer before that, to 2014, when Kelsey doesn't yet know about Goodreads. Kelsey, however, would really like to read a book. And so she is in a bookstore, where she is about to make a book buying mistake. Young Kelsey is thrifty, and so she is looking at the bargain table at the bookstore, where there are some very enticingly low prices. And one of the books on the bargain table for a remarkably low discount price is shiny. It has a shiny cover. Young Kelsey thinks that she, with a freshly minted college degree, should be reading adult books with literary merit. She looks closer at the shiny book. It has all sorts of blurbs about its literary merit on the cover, all sorts of literary accolades, and thus reassured that she is making good choices for her intellectual well-being. She purchases a book that has a cover and title that look and sound like they could be the cover and title of a fantasy novel, but is in fact an extremely unremarkable work of mundane fiction called Heir to the Glimmering World by Cynthia Ozick. To be fair, by the time young Kelsey read this in 2016, she was on Goodreads and knew that she had probably made a mistake. But to give credit where credit is due, she did read the book she purchased within a reasonable time frame after buying it, which is more than can be said for me now. She then gave it 2 stars and got it out of her life. The end. Except this isn't actually the end of this video because I do want to do a bit of discussion, so hang on for that. Okay, so first of all, I am very intrigued by how my list is like really dramatically different from Angela's. I'll link her video down below, you should watch it. These days, Angela and I have like a decent amount of overlap in what we read, so I was really surprised that in this list, the only book that we have overlapping is Fireheart Tiger. The City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders was also on her list, which is a book that I have read, but it didn't actually make my bottom 20 because I have read books with worse Goodreads ratings. Now, I credit a lot of what's going on in my bottom 20 list here to like questionable reading decisions in my early years of Goodreads usage. And so I think the patterns that I'm seeing in my list are different from the ones Angela was seeing in hers. I'm seeing a lot of books published in the 2010s on this list, not a lot published in the 2020s. I think, reading better books now. But there's also a bit of a recentness bias, I think, in Goodreads ratings. Like, more recent books will tend to have a higher overall average rating. A lot of those books aren't gonna stand the test of time as well for new readers, and those ratings will go down. The biggest observation that Angela had about her list is, I think, a very real thing with Goodreads ratings, even though I'm not seeing it in my bottom 20, which is that particularly weird, challenging books by BIPOC authors seem to have much lower Goodreads ratings than similarly weird, experimental, challenging books by white authors. I think I'm not seeing this on my list as much, just because I haven't read quite as many, like, intensely weird books as Angela. Like, I like to think that I really like to read weird, structurally innovative, narratively challenging, speculative fiction, but then I don't actually reach for them very often. So I just don't have as many of them that could have shown up in my bottom 20 Goodreads. I do want to point out, though, that my biggest shocker on this list, the one with which I am most upset and disappointed to discover that it has this low a Goodreads rating, absolutely fits this mold. That's Under the Pendulum Sun. This book had absolutely no business being on this list. What do you mean its average Goodreads rating is only, what, 3.44? Also, I am currently reading a book that fits this mold. This is Rake's Fall by Vajra Chandrasekhara. This is, so far, I'm about halfway in, absolutely like one of the top 5 weirdest books I've ever read. I am in the midst of it. I am in the middle of the struggle to figure out what is going on in this book. Don't ask me to tell you what my rating is going to be at the end of this, because I have no clue at this point. However, the current average rating for this is 3.39. So if I had waited until I finished this book to make this video, this would have ended up, let's see where it would have ended up. This would have ended up in my 10th place spot, above Fireheart Tiger, but below the Stone Fae. And this is a brand new release. Like, brand new releases usually get a decent amount of, like, Goodreads ratings boost. Whereas if I compare this to a couple of the other weirdest books I have ever read, like I mentioned Radiance by Catherynne and Valente earlier in this video, because it's not on this list, whereas Space Opera is. Super weird book. Loved it. 5 stars. Super weird book. 3.72 rating. Nowhere near this list. To name another super, super weird book that I didn't like personally for me on the other end of the spectrum, by a white author, Born by Jeff Vandermeer. I didn't like this one. It's got a 3.93, so if I think of those as like the 2 comparable books to this one, yeah, I see that. I see that trend. The one observation I do want to make about my list that is not about my questionable reading choices in the 2010s is that there are exactly 2 romance novels on my list, and they are both sapphic. I'm gonna leave that without comment. So dare I ask, what about you? Do your bottom 20 average rated books on Goodreads reveal something scathing and insightful about the reader community online? Or do they just leave you embarrassed and making excuses for your younger self? Anyways, I hope you got something out of this video. I hope you have a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.